Thank you. I appreciate being here, both for the hospitality I've received since I arrived yesterday, and also for the privilege of commenting on themes related to Carolyn Merchant's splendid work in the field. And as you will see, I find it challenging to stay in dialogue with her. Let me ask first about organisms and machines. She has a way of lamenting the loss of the organic category, which she couples with the feminine category. Here she says, the female earth and virgin earth spirit were subdued by the machine. Again, she says, between the 16th and 17th centuries, the image of an organic cosmos with a living female earth at its center gave way to a mechanistic view. I think the first successes in the scientific revolution were, if you want, astronomical. And they were also in physics. And I think we still do think of physics and astronomy as non-organic, as mechanical. In a way, much of what we know about the heavens above is pretty well covered by the machine metaphor. Of course, we also worry that the clockwork metaphor pushed too far gives us problems. I think, for instance, of Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate, first 3 minutes. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. But that's not the only way physicists and mathematicians, astronomers think. They often find wonder and beauty in the universe, as did, both Newton and Einstein. Einstein said famously, the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. Eugene Wigner, physicist, mathematician, the enormous usefulness of mathematics in the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. See, mathematics works even where we are unable to reason in any visual or everyday sense. So rather curious, and now it is the high-level abstract mathematics thinking of nature in more or less mechanistic terms that's enabled us to see much of the richness and beauty of nature. Now, neither mathematics nor other forms of physics anywhere know the categories of life and death or conscious experience. Of course, if we are to understand these aspects of the physical world, we have to come up with categories of interpretation. The big scale world and the small scale world, the world of the atomic nucleus, finding out that there's fine tuning connections between them. Now, it's not organic, it's not alive, but often Carolyn wants interconnectedness, and if that's what you want, there's plenty of that in physics. And of course, we know that the cosmological world, the world of physics, still contains some elements of chaos. We're told that in weather systems, the way a butterfly shakes its wings in Beijing can affect the weather in California. There are trigger points that are statistically washed out for the most part, but sometimes they are relevant. And although we marvel at this beauty, there's nothing in astrophysics that we have to interpret in the nurturing mother image. You can say, if you want, that the heavens are, in some sense, as Martin Rees, British astronomer, said, our cosmic habitat. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have the heavens above producing the stardust out of which we came. But maybe we don't entirely want to think about the cosmos, the heavens above. We want to think about life here, this planet. And now, survival is the name of the game. We might worry about nature red in tooth and claw. Most of our words for nature, coming from Latin and Greek, have a sort of giving birth dimension to them. There's native, nation, naval, go back to Latin words, and to an earlier Greek word for giving birth. And likewise, words such as generate, genesis, progeny, pregnant, they too go back to giving birth. And you might say, in that sense, at least on Earth, the feminine metaphor has been important. Now, however, the problem is not the death of nature, the problem is death in nature. We have to wonder what account to give that everything is constantly dying in this earthen natural world. As dominant a metaphor as any in biology is the sense of information. I studied physics in college and was taught there are two kinds of things in the world, matter and energy. Einstein's work already united matter and energy. But when I went over to the biology department, they said, wait a minute, is something these physicists don't know anything about. Information. And that's what's coded in living organisms, information. In that sense, events on Earth stand in marked contrast with any other places we yet know about, because an organism, through its genetic system, is informed about how to make a way through the world. An organism is tested for adapted fit, we say, and that's a matter of keeping past information and elaborating it into possibly new information. And that, I think, is not particularly male or female, though both males and females have genes. If we ask about this adapted fit, we may be told that survival of the fittest. What does that mean? That sort of means that the organism survives, male or female, that's better adapted for doing what? For sending information to the next generation. It's survival of the senders, if you want some participation and independence. We wonder if the evolutionary ecosystem is headed anywhere. It's kind of a dangerous word to use among biologists, but repeatedly we get what? Forests. Again and again and again, wherever there's enough moisture. Or we get grasslands where there isn't enough moisture for forests. Or we get eyes that have been evolved, we don't know, but perhaps a dozen times. Flight has evolved on a number of occasions. So certain things reappear. In that sense, we sort of need to put an hour on evolutionary time. Things are tested for their capacity to care for the life they've inherited and pass it on. Earth is a fertile planet. Is that a leading or a misleading metaphor? Let's ask about entering the Anthropocene epoch. Merchant says in one place that ecological revolutions occur through which different societies change their relationships with nature. Well, now we're told our relationship to nature is going to be the Anthropocene epoch, when we re-engineer our Earth. And that becomes what we might call high-profile discourse. Carolyn has wanted to talk about partnership. It's a term I like, but I'm wondering if the Anthropocene is a suitable kind of partnership. Well, here we are told that the Anthropocene is humanity's driving, defining moment. We are the God species, says Mark Linus. Special issue Scientific American. What kind of planet do we want? What kind of planet can we get? Now, I do think we need to wonder about Carolyn's controlling metaphors and where they are taking us. Are we being taken to new forms of partnership or partnership ethic? Yes, we think things are interdependent. Well, I like the idea of partnership, but when I come across a rattlesnake in the Colorado mountains, partnership gets a little difficult. Or when I was in Africa, kayaking on crocodile-infested waters, I didn't want the kind of partnership that crocodiles had in mind. What is this attitude of humans toward nature? Well, we're told that humans can get rid of the crocodiles, and it'd be better for humans. Humans, nothing is lost if humans rid the landscape of rattlesnakes because they don't do humans any good, for example. We're now being told that we're going on the great acceleration. We're going to make human progress progressively upscaled, peaked out, managing an engineered planet that we don't need to think further about ecosystem services. The planetary managers will see to it that we have the rainfall we need. They will see to it that we have the fertilizer for the soil we need. Now I begin to wonder that so far from partnership, this entering the Anthropocene, what denatures us. Is that what we want? Let me invite you to think about Earth as what I'll call the planet with promise. And there we'll go back to Jewish monotheism. Carolyn doesn't like patriarchs and male monotheism. Maybe. But she probably does like a land flowing with milk and honey. That's, I think, a legacy from the past we might be able to use. Yes, humans were made in the image of God. Humans were put in their place to be caretakers, stewards, trustees of a creation. I think we might pick up that theme and see, well, it wasn't just Israel. Earth is the promised land, the planet with promise to be thought of as a divine gift. The astronauts, certainly when they saw Earth from space, were inclined to think, wow, that's a marvelous home planet. A white, glistening pearl in a thick sea of black mystery, as Edgar Mitchell said. Michael Collins recalls being earth-struck, seeing Earth rising from the moon. on the Earthrise on the moon. Earth is to be treasured and nurtured, something precious that must endure. Even Ed Wilson, whom I've known over many years, calls himself a secular humanist, says, the biospheric membrane that covers the earth and you and me is the miracle we have been given. We love our landscapes, Palestine, but Israel, but the British, the French, the Americans, the Chinese, we delight in these landscapes on which we reside, and there we can think of ourselves as partners with landscapes east and west, around the globe, except Antarctica, have become landscapes that we can love and flourish. So we are natives of nations, but we are also earthlings, earth natives too. These ancient Hebrews were given a promised land, but they were given a promised land with a mandate. A mandate to see that there was justice. You don't have a land flowing with milk and honey unless justice rolls down like water. Yes, the Hebrew people were saved in the days of Noah, but just a few people were saved. God was more interested in the wildlife than he was the humans when he reestablished that covenant. So I think we humans belong on the planet. Yes, I do. I'm an environmentalist. But I think humans belong on the planet. It's our home as much for us as the others. But this glistening pearl in space ought to be something we think of as a sacred biosphere to inhabit with love. If humans can increasingly inherit and treasure their planet with promise, then I think we'll know what Carolyn Merchant wants to say to us today and tomorrow and forever. Amen.
Thank you so much. And we have a little time for questions.
I'm a shrine. Yes. This is Carolyn's sister, and Strong. He says she's a feminist strong.
I would like to give the cosmos a little bit more credit than you seem to, because we are clearly dependent on the sun for life on Earth.
Yes.
And we all learned in grade school, I think, that life began in water. Well, where did the water come from on Earth? It came primarily from comets, who come from outer space, not too far outer space, but outer space. And we owe the whole existence of the Earth to the birth of the sun and the birth of the planets. So I think it's important when we're talking about nature to invoke the whole cosmos as
Sure.
part of what we have on Earth. We wouldn't even have Earth if we didn't have the whole solar system forming. And suppose we didn't even have the moon, we wouldn't have tides on
Yeah.
Earth. So there's a whole lot of stuff that we owe to the cosmos.
We, of course, all the heavy elements heavier than hydrogen, helium, perhaps the bits of boron,
No lithium.
lithium, are made in the stars. So you don't have any oxygen, any carbon, any nitrogen. If the stars aren't up there making this stuff,
That's right.
you can, if you like, you can think of yourself, as I mentioned already, as fossil stardust. But if you're having a bad day, you can think of yourself as nuclear waste.
Well, I like the way Carl Sagan expressed it. Carl Sagan said we're all star stuff. Because you're right, there was hydrogen, helium, and a tiny bit of lithium. The rest of it was all forged in stars, all the other chemical elements. So he would talk about the calcium in your bones and the iron in your blood were forged in stars. So we got to give the cosmos a lot of credit for this.
Let's give a hand for the cosmos.
Further questions or comments?
I have a personal comment, please. Early in this, you had said something like, there's got to be another way, or there is another way, or something to that effect. And I found that personally very reassuring.
Thank you.
Thank you.
About thinking of genes and the genetic process, not simply as being selfish and so forth, as we've so often heard. Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. Selfish genes don't get you far, and even Dawkins wrote a book on the extended phenotype. So selfish genes are dead ends if that's all they do. The whole thing a gene has to do is get itself surviving in the next generation. The genes are gone, but the information is passed on from one generation to the next. In that sense, I like to say that biology, genetics is all about sharing, not selfishness. And I'm using the word sharing, of course, and things are distributed in shares, but that's what happens in genetics. And the best information, which gives you the best adaptive fit, which is most likely to keep life flourishing and prospering, is what gets tested for in this biological world we inhabit. That's, I think, the kind of caring that Carolyn Merchant might like.
Even rattlesnakes and crocodiles.
They have to survive.
Touche.
We have time for one more. One more comment or question.
One more, you're told. I see one
Okay, we
hand.
have a candidate back. It seems a lot of what you discussed, the process is in the context of the Anthropocene.
Yeah,
Much of the current literature focuses on devolution, and yet what you've been talking about is that which drives evolution. And perhaps the arc that we might be taking in an idealistic moment in response to this devolutionary time of the Anthropocene. So I very much appreciated your comments because they were deeply ingrained in a longer arc than we are now.
And do you have a question, or is this mostly comment?
It's a comment.
Comment.
No, I do wonder what you think of this notion of devolution and devolutionary times in relation to the Anthropocene and evolution. And that, where does the power come from to drive a different tilt?
Well, I am a monotheist. I'm a Christian. And I do think that in the evolution of life on Earth, you know, I take all the biologists say seriously. But when I ask about whether there's a heading to evolution, I had to be a little ginger about that process, but I do think that evolution is going somewhere. And I think the ultimate power behind that is got something to do with the sacred, something to do with the divine. We've got a universe in which started in a quantum fluctuation in a vacuum and got at least as far as Albert Einstein and his theories of relativity, if not Rachel Carson and her wonder at life. That's a pretty impressive universe, isn't it? And it needs a fuller explanation than I think we typically get from biologists. You know what I do with biologists who are skeptics? We got some in this room. I say, is Earth a wonderland? They don't want to make of that word. They don't want to. I didn't ask them, is there progress? I didn't ask them, is there a God? I just said, do you think Earth is a wonderland? And I watch them squirm. And when I see this one squirming a little bit, I say, how about it, Dick Jones, whatever. And none of them wants to deny that Earth is a wonderland. They'd be ashamed of themselves if they came out and said that. That gets a good conversation started, doesn't it?
Yes.
About what is the worth, value, origin, meaning of Wonderland Earth. Then a biologist will start talking philosophy with you. Okay, we're ready for
Thank you so much for traveling all this way. I really appreciate it. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Whitney Bauman. Whitney is associate professor. I guess we can wait a minute. Is associate professor of religious studies at Florida International University. He lectures on science and religion, religion and nature, and religion and queer theory. His books include Religion and Ecology, Developing a Planetary Ethic, Theology, Creation, and Environmental Ethics from 2009 with Kevin O'Brien and Richard Bohannon. Grounding Religion, a field guide to the study of religion and ecology. The second revised edition was published in 2017. And with Lucas Johnson, he authored Science and Religion, One Planet, Many Possibilities. A wonderland, in fact, I think, in 2014. He's currently working on a manuscript that examines the religious influences on Ernst Haeckel's understanding of the natural world. Whitney, you want to come on up? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We just need to stand up here. Because it's after lunchtime, so I feel like if I sit, I'll fall asleep. even listening to, well, especially listening to myself. Okay, so first of all, I want to echo the thanks for being here. It's been a long journey for us to get this book into publication, and a lot of things have happened. I just want to mention, in addition to what Ken had mentioned earlier in the day, a lot of us experienced loss. Ken and I both lost our fathers. Elizabeth's father had a significant health scare. One of the contributors who was an important part of the volume, Rosemary Ruther, had a stroke which left her incapacitated. So there's been a lot of personal things that go along in this book too. And so when you see that the volume is dedicated to our three fathers, you'll know why a volume about Carolyn Merchant is dedicated to three men. So, I just wanted to add that in there as well. So I'm one of the lucky people from the Graduate Theological Union that got to work with Carolyn Merchant during my dissertation years. And I was part of this little group called TREES, the Theological Roundtable on Ecological Ethics and Spirituality. And we raised money it was actually a grant to bring together Rosemary and Carolyn in a joint course between UC Berkeley and the GTU. And that course was called Religion, Culture, Gender, and Nature, or something like that. And this is actually the image that's on the poster for that course, I remember. So I like that it's on one of your latest books. But during that course, we had a lot of people. By the way, this is that's me and another TREES member on that side, and two other TREES members on the end. And then there's Carolyn, of course, Rosemary Ruther, and Mary Evelyn Tucker, who some of you may know. All of who are part of this course and conference. So we had a conference and a course, and some of the people in the room were here for those things. Mark Stoll came to speak for the course. Theodore Hebert, Friedel Capper, Mary Evelyn Tucker, and John Grimm. Rosemary Ruther, of course, and Carolyn Merchant. Val Plumwood, Norman Worslet, and Carol Crest were all part of people that partook in that. So that really was a sort of great defining moment of my graduate education. So that's my little personal note to start off with. So what I want to talk about today is sort of where my current research is going in light of how I think Carolyn Merchant has influenced it. And my current research is sort of looking at religion, nature, and queer theory. And that is because most people found gender binarisms, patriarchies, narratives, either in God or in nature, and what they think is ultimate. And I think this is what queer theory is trying to undo, but I think Carolyn Merchant does it in a better way without using the words like abjection, subjection, performativity, these sorts of things. Homonormativity, heteronormativity, we can talk about this in a much better way, right? Let's deal with the narrative of progress and the narrative of declines if there might be something else. We can talk about sort of spreading agency beyond the human to the rest of the natural world, or how the self is developed in relationship to others without using obtuse language, but maybe with understanding the partnership ethic a little bit better, right? So I think that specifically in this chapter, my argument is that queer theorists have something to learn from Carolyn Merchant, and that is to extend their theories past the human into the rest of the natural world, where queer theory is usually stuck. Not always, but mostly. So what I want to do now is just read sort of a section of this. This is the sort of constructive section, and it's my favorite part. So now you can just skip over my chapter when you all right. So Merchant's work in critically assessing environmental history and the narratives found therein could contribute to the querying of environmental discourse. Through challenging the narratives of mechanical models of nature, humans as stewards, and paying close attention to the objective earth bodies, there's that little queer theory word, that accumulate around mechanical models and narratives of progress and decline, Merchant's work, like queer theory, helps to destabilize the patriarchal and hierarchical relationships among different types of humans and between humans and the rest of the natural world. Queer theory does this through challenging gender binarism, sexual dimorphism, and the heteronormativity dictated by the patriarchal hierarchical ordering of earth bodies. Merchant's work, in addition to some of these similar critiques of sexism, also critiques anthropocentrism and returns agency to the world through her engagement with chaos and complexity theories, in order to begin to look at how humans might live in partnership with the rest of the natural world, which many of us have talked about today. Merchant's more environmentally focused critique and queer theory's more human critique are both rattling the same structures that keep humans locked into binary thinking about sex, gender, and sexuality, and keep humans as in a place over and above the rest of the natural world. So together, I think they would make a stronger and more robust critique to bring these two discourses together. Merton's work is not entirely void of critiques of heteronormativity. She recognizes that the partnership model can extend beyond heteronormative models to include all types of partnerships: business, same-sex, kinship with other animals, and human relationships with other species and organisms, and the more than human world. In this recognition alone, we might understand Merton's narrative models as a part of the larger project of queering environmental discourse, which I'll say more a little bit about in a minute. However, there are also some less obvious ways that Merton's project could prove productive in dialogue with queering discourses surrounding both religion and nature. It's no accident that her work tends to deal with religious and scientific narratives. These are the two discursive areas that tend to lock identities into some sort of fixed place. For instance, science tells us what is natural and unnatural, and religious tells us what is God-given or against God's plan. I don't need to rehearse the atrocities done to the actual bodies of women, Native peoples, people of color, and LGBTQ peoples, among others, in the name of both nature and God. Picking away at the narrative fray of what nature is and how God functions then helps loosen our identities from these anchors. We are in a world of becoming in which unstable identities influence and change one another on a daily basis and toward an uncertain future. Although there may be some direction in which we're going, I'm not sure how we tell which direction that is. There are rules, but they are not the rules of mechanical nature, efficient causality, gender and sex binaries, or God-given realities. There are rules, rather, based upon habits of becoming in the world, and these habits of becoming can and do change. What features might be needed for new narratives that pay close attention to this queer reality and to all the planetary agents that are continually interacting and co-creating our worlds on a moment-by-moment basis? First, and for reasons already discussed, I think we need precisely a narrative that is not based on progress or decline, and a narrative that understands agency as diffuse, not just contained within humans and the human world. Check. Merton's work, among others, are doing this work. Okay? Second, and related, I think we need narratives that take unknowing seriously. As theologian Catherine Keller notes, certainty often shuts down conversations. We get locked into our own perspectives, and there can be no dialogue with another. She says in other places that there's been more violence done in the name of certainty than uncertainty ever has caused. The world's religious traditions have such narrative resources, from non-absolutism and multi-perspectivalism in Jainism, to impermanence and change in Buddhism, to the concept of neti-neti, not this, not that, in Hinduism, to the mystical traditions of apophasis, or negative theologies in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, just to name a few. Idolatry is nothing more than equating something in flux and impermanent with an enduring ultimate reality. Alfred North Whitehead, who Keller draws from and who also knows a thing or two about chaos and complexity, called this the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Val Plumwood, whose work Merton engages in developing her partnership ethic, also argued for something like a dialogical approach to human and earth others, in which the other's influence on the self is not backgrounded or denied, but rather acknowledged and allowed to possibly change one's own self-understanding. Uncertainty in our knowing, then, and relations with others seems to be an important part of developing planetary narratives and ethics, rather than limiting such narratives and ethics to the boundaries of species, nation, or religion, for instance. Third, that might be a harder part, but this is going to probably be the hardest part. Third, we need stories, concepts, ideas, models, and theories, not necessarily grand overarching narratives, that place us first and foremost within a planetary context as creatures among other creatures. Most of our extant religious traditions, for instance, just checking my time there, most of our extant religious narratives have a serious problem in that humans are identified first and foremost as special, and especially the adherents to a given tradition. That tradition will identify them as very special. Most of our extant philosophical systems also provide a special place for humans vis-a-vis the rest of the natural world. And perhaps the worst ism the world has yet seen is the carving up of the world through much bloodshed, genocide, and also oftentimes arbitrarily into nation states or nationalism, something which is, of course, on the rise again today. These localized identities, helpful as they may have been at one point, are actually stumbling blocks when trying to deal with the quote-unquote wicked problems such as climate change, acidification of oceans, and global species decline. The process of globalization, though not equal in its distribution of goods and ills, of course, means that we are radically connected on a daily basis. Every solution, then, must keep this global network of human interactions in mind, not to mention the rest of the planetary community. I think Merton's partnership ethic and understanding of nature's autonomy help us to think in this planetary direction. There are many ways of working out such a narrative. One can get there through significant updates to extant religious narratives. That's what Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm are doing in their whole religion and ecology program. One can get there through religious naturalisms and stories such as the Epic of Evolution. People like Ursula Goodenough and even, I would argue, sometimes Terence Deacon, I think, is looking at as developing these religious naturalisms. There's someone like Thomas Berry who does that based upon the universe story, right? Which I say on the next page. I should never skip ahead. Though one need not be explicitly religious, I would argue that religion at its root is the practice of making meaning. It means to reread or to bind together at its root. So it's about making meaning of our lives. In this sense, narratives are meaning-making practices, so even secular environmentalism can be understood as religious. Regardless of the narratives that get us there, and whether we agree that they are religious or not, we can quibble about that, behind closed doors. We must get to a place in which we first and foremost think of ourselves as planetary citizens and creatures among other creatures. Fourth, I think that's my last point. Nope, there's 5, okay. Sorry. Fourth, and related, I think we need to begin thinking of humans as evolving planetary creatures. We are evolving with humans, other animals, bacteria, viruses, and technologies. Something Baird was talking about earlier with the microbiome. To really open ourselves to a future in which we become partners with the rest of the planetary community, we can no longer wall ourselves off as a species from all others. Humans will evolve beyond themselves one way or another. Thinking imaginatively about how that happens could help us to create some new narratives for the planetary community. Trickster figures from many indigenous peoples might provide a model for how we might navigate between humans and other animals. Tricksters navigate, blur, and shift the boundaries between male-female, human-animal, the living and the dead, thereby opening us up for new kinds of relationship with human and earth others. Scholarship in trans and posthumanism, even, might help us navigate how we understand ourselves evolving technologically. We can't leave it up to those who just dream of becoming a full-on cyborg, right? The point is that if we open ourselves toward evolving with the planetary community, rather than remaining locked into our static understanding of humanity as if that is always going to be in stasis, then we can begin to create technologies for the planetary community and not just for the benefits of human. So how do we create a planetary technologies, technologies that help us think of ourselves and acknowledge ourselves as planetary citizens? So fifth and finally, we must begin to co-create narratives, I think, that keep us focused on how our narratives affect Earth bodies differently. Not all bodies are the same, obviously. In other words, how do our actions ripple out and affect Earth others in both anticipated and unanticipated ways? If narratives are living, they must be for the living, and they must be adaptable to mitigate unforeseen negative consequences, present and future. Critical academic scholarship is constantly revising and or replacing narratives so that narratives that were once sexist, racist, or homophobic are no longer held on to. Well, not for everyone, but that's the idea of this critical discourse. Though the process must continue to do this ad infinitum, as these are persistent and newly emerging isms always play a given narrative, unintended consequence. We need to continue revising and replacing always in a way that also addresses speciesism and what I might call presentism, or what others call presentism as well. Speciesism is Peter Singer's word to describe, of course, the assumption that humans are ethically and or morally more valuable than other life on the planet. Presentism is a word that I'm using to designate the myopic view of the future of life on the planet, on the one hand, so the future is just going to be the same as it is now, and the supersessionist attitude of the present in a given moment on the other. We are much better off than what was in the past. Presentism means mistaking our own historically, culturally embodied location as the point at which we can narrate a universal perspective again. This is exactly sort of where Ernst Haeckel gets in trouble when he has a very somewhat vitalistic understanding of nature, but he gets stuck in his own cultural moment and projects sort of the history of evolution that just leads right up to European culture. And so, this is my conclusion here. As partners within an evolving planetary community, we will always be engaged in reimagining our lives together and opening onto new and unexpected partners that arise in this process. This is yet another advantage of Merton's partnership metaphor. So to conclude, Ursula Le Guin, my friend in the room here, Lisa Stenmark, always reminds me, recently called for science fiction writers to help us to think of and imagine the world in new ways. Nothing could be a more appropriate way to end this chapter than with a quote from that speech. In a way, it sums up the ways in which Merton's critical and creative narrative approach might help us to see the planetary community through new eyes, or in a word, queerly. Le Guin writes, "Hard times are coming. When we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its excessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality. I can't think of a better way to heed Le Guin's call than to imagine narratives for planetary partnerships of the kind that Merton calls for."
We have about 10 minutes for questions or comments. Which you seem to be a commenting crowd. Questions for Whitney?
Thank you so much. That was such an incredible analysis of Carolyn's work and incredible clear analysis. I'm just wondering, specifically in terms of climate change and queering and kind of reconciling those two things, if you've gone that way at all or are thinking about that.
Yeah, it's hard.
Sorry.
No. It's in terms of looking at climate change sort of from a queer eye or something.
Yeah.
Queer eye for climate change.
Yeah.
We'll do a series out of this.
That's
Okay.
exactly what I'm here.
Well, I do think that part of the reason, so it's weird because I think that part of the reasons that we have something like postmodern discourse are because of including queer theory, or because of the problems that got us here in the first place. Gender, the spread of colonialism and gender binarism along with it is one of those, and that's the need for queer theory. The Industrial Revolution and the subsequent problems with the climate are the reason that we have, largely have this environmental movement that's trying to deal with wicked problems and issues of chaos and complexity and these sorts of things. The whole globalization itself that began to challenge all these single narratives as cultures come into contact with one another, then forced the need for postmodern critiques of all different sides, whether it's feminist or critical race theory or queer theory or whatever. And so I'm not answering your question, but I do think that part of the problem with understanding, climate change is this idea that we do have some sort of still managerial role, right? As Carolyn's critiqued, and that the queering of the human by placing us within the climate will begin to understand ourselves not as the end-all solvers of climate change, but as a part in the process. And then sort of what is our role in it? And then we have to keep critiquing that role as the effects ripple out and sort of continue, rather than just sort of charging through with the same program. Like sort of, I always take the Green Revolution as an example. right? It was supposed to be this good thing built on good intentions, but it ends up, impoverishing a lot of people with the spread of industrial agriculture around the world. So it starts out with a good idea. Let's feed the world, but then these bad effects happen, and it's almost as if nobody could say, "Oh, whoops, we shouldn't have done that," right? Nobody that had orchestrated the thing. Whereas I feel like if we were more open to this sort of the ill effects of our solutions, or if we understood our solutions as wicked, then that would be helpful. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know how to exactly answer your question.
You pick.
Do I pick your sister or you first? Is this going to lead to a sibling rivalry?
She's my kid sister, so I go.
Okay.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, and especially this wonderful picture, this great photo, which is there we go. And that's an amazing conjunction between me and Rosemary Radford Luther. And that was a fabulous course that we taught that was joint between the GTU and UC Berkeley. And we had it over at Coleman Hall, which was kind of the closest you could get to the GTU, but still be on the Berkeley campus. And I am just so sad that Rosemary has had this stroke, because she had started writing something for this volume, and not to be able to communicate and to complete that is just an incredibly sad story. You're pointing out that the cover of my new book, if you hold it up again, you see if you can show the picture a little bit better. Take your fingers off.
Oh, sorry. Just be direct. Be direct.
So this was on, and Whitney, I think you were mainly responsible for putting that picture on the poster.
Greg Zuschlag and I, yeah.
What?
Greg Zuschlag and I.
Yeah. And on the poster, which is still in my office attached to my filing cabinet. So I see it every day when I go in. But one of the reasons I chose it for Science and Nature, Past, Present, and Future, which is a collection of articles that peer-reviewed, formerly published articles that kind of exemplify my career, is it's science and nature. So here is this guy poking his head and his hand through the crystalline spheres, through the edge of the cosmos, looking into the rest of the universe, into the wheels that made the Earth turn around, and the celestial spheres, and in the olden days of the Ptolemy and Copernicus epicycles and so on. But then the rest of it is nature, and it's the Earth, and there are wonderful green trees and sunshine and so on the Earth. So it brings science and nature together.
Right.
And I can also attribute some of that to Anne, who was an astronomer, and you may now take your turn.
I was just going to say really quick, I always use this as an example for what a paradigm shift is, in the classroom. And I always liken this to what it must have been like for Copernicus or Bruno, but in the same way. So, but I also just want to say that, you taught me how to critique nature, and Rosemary taught me how to critique religion. So I wouldn't have been able to get to the position where I was without this sort of coming together. So, yeah.
Well, I'm a novice in this area, but I don't know what you mean by queer theory.
So it's, let's see how to describe it. So it's sort of a step beyond sort of identity politics, right? So it's trying to argue that identities are actually shifting. And so we can't just say gay, straight, male, female, but there's a whole spectrum of ways that people exist in the world, and we can't sort of strap people into this one conception, because like for me, I could tell you right now, I'm a professor, I was a student of Carolyn Merchant's, but I'm not telling you everything about me, I also love to go to the beach, and I love Berlin, but so there's always something left out of a definition of a thing. So the words never quite reach the thing in itself. So there's always something left over, and queer theory says, hey, don't forget about what's left out of your concept and your definition. And it starts with a critique of queer identities and heteronormativity being assumed. It's sort of how heteronormativity is assumed not only in the human world, but if you read people like Linnaeus, and it's read back into the plant and animal world too. So Linnaeus imagines plants as these little families with a male and a female and children, and this sort of thing, right? Well, they're plants, right? So, part of the what Holmes Rolston III was talking about. Holmes, I'll just call you Holmes. What Professor Rolston was talking about in his speech, that we ought to talk about the great cooperation in evolution is just as, if not more important than this idea of sexual reproduction and survival of the fittest. But it took a while for that look at cooperation in nature, mainly through feminists and other people's looking back at the story of evolution and saying, hey, there's not just, Joan Roughgarden comes to mind, there's not just competition and sexual selection and these sorts of things, but hey, there's a lot of cooperation. And not to mention that, there's a lot of different types of sexualities, from asexual to hermaphroditic to things that shift their sex over their single lifetime, so on and so forth. So
I think we only have time for one more question. Did you ever end up, Allison? No? Okay.
Yes. Thanks for this great talk. It's a really very interesting talk. Last night, Carolyn was referring to this 2050, when we would probably cross that boundary on that image and move into some other kind of state called sustainability. And you talk about also something that you seem to be hinting at, something we must approach, something that is better than now. And then you use the word humanity as something that maybe we now have to transcend. And we also heard, for example, I think it was Holmes that mentioned the word biosphere. And of course, the word biosphere is from 1924, I think, or something like that, by Vernadsky. So maybe we need to also move beyond that. And then, so I'm pretty intrigued by this optimism, if I may say so, about something that will appear as we move along, some metaphysical dimension here that I find very interesting and promising. But then you also mentioned nationalism and how it somehow bounces back now. So not everything people in the room seem to believe in is not so popular with everybody else. So why do you think it is that so many bounce back? And particularly, well, the administration was country.
Yeah.
So how? Why isn't people like you heeded more easily?
Well, I think so I don't know. If I knew the answer to that, then I would be a great political consultant, and this country would be in a better place. But I'm not sure it's a bouncing back. But I think it was in one of the lectures that I heard Barry give that this really sort of stuck with me, that there's this idea of the planetary might be a way to navigate away from either a reversion to nationalism as from the detrimental causes of neoliberal globalization, or neoliberal globalization is normal, right? Which is clearly like sort of the Democrats in this country want to keep marching down the neoliberal path and just try to do social and environmental protections. And then, the more conservative Republican side, this is a, gross sort of, I'm not being very clear in my analysis, but want to revert back to some sort of nationalism, right? And so is there a way forward to doing that, and maybe perhaps promoting this unknown planetary identity? We are planetary citizens, is a path forward. We don't know what that looks like, but that's precisely why we need speculative fiction. We can't know what that looks like. We can hope that a new path is going to emerge, but we don't even know what possibilities are possible until we begin to imagine what that might look like. And so that's why I think, along with Luke Lynn or Donna Haraway or Lisa Stenmark, that we need speculative fiction. We need this sort of imaginative thinking about the future in sort of radically different ways.
Okay, I believe.
Sorry if I didn't get right there, but.
For one.
Yeah, I wanted to, in terms of looking at Native American thinking, what may be, I'm thinking of Carolyn's sister's question. Native Americans identified at least 5 different sexualities before Christians came to impose the binary male-female as socially constructed and religiously imposed. Have you done any, I know you mentioned tricksters and so forth, but in terms of looking at these sexualities before the Christians imposed on those societies, and also I assume you know that what often would take place in tribes is at the 5-year-old point, there would be a bowl and a bow and arrow or something that would be normally at each extreme. And if a child picked up, if a boy child picked up the bowl, that was very special and gifted person who may have been, lack of a better word, groomed to be a shaman or a chief. And similarly for a girl child, if that child picked up the bow and arrow. Do you have any research that you have done in Native American cultures and contributions that might have in contributing to queer theory and answering questions like
Yeah, and I think it's sort of not very specific within Native traditions, but I will say this amongst cultures all over the world. Prior to colonization, there are 3rd, 4th, 5th. I mean, even the Talmud identifies 4 genders, right? So the Hijra of India, the Wadiya of Indonesia, the Filipina of Fiji, I think. But there, literally, I've done this once with my queer theory course. I had my students find an alphabet. For each letter of the alphabet, a queer identity, a historical identity that's beyond the gender or sex binary, and you can go from A to Z. So it's really, really interesting. All of these identities that are not just by religion, and I mean, especially monotheisms initially, that are sort of forced into this gender binary, but also by the medical community. The Intersex Society of America is trying to get the American Medical Association to put a stop to gender reassignment surgery or gender assignment surgery at birth, and let the child decide once that child becomes of age enough to decide whether or not he or she wants to be he, she, or they, it's just queer, right? So I think that's an important step to make. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce Laura Watt. Do you need to? Laura Watt is a friend that I admire very much. She's also a professor of geography, environment, and planning at Sonoma State University, specializing in landscape history, management, and policy. Her book, The Paradox of Preservation, Wilderness and Working Landscapes at Point Reyes National Seashore, was published in 2017 by UC Press, and is an amazing contribution to a controversy that is very close to my heart. I think it's the controversy at Point Reyes is both a reflection and a precursor of many controversies we're likely to have when it comes to management of our natural-ish lands. So, Laura, do you want to come on up?
Okay. All right, this feels like it's going to be a little bit of a change of pace from the previous talks. And hopefully that's not a bad thing. But it includes more pictures at least. So it is an enormous honor to be included as a speaker at this event. Carolyn was not on my dissertation committee, but I took one of my first classes here. My first semester of my doctoral program was taking her graduate course in environmental history, and at the same time taking a class up in the law school from Joe Sachs, who basically invented environmental law, and reading David Lowenthal, who was here earlier today, about landscape and preservation. And so my head kind of exploded that semester. What a way to start. And I also had the honor of teaching with Caroline. I think I TA'd either 3 or 4 classes while I was here of hers. And so it's wonderful to come back and sort of rethink the enormous influence that she has had and the ideas that I experienced in her courses and in teaching with her on the work that I've done ever since. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that I've done at Point Reyes, and then a little bit about a new project that I'm working on in Colorado. So, go forward. So as is probably fairly familiar to everyone in this room, after McAvoy identified ecology, production, and cognition as sort of key analytic levels in environmental history, Carolyn Merchant took it a step further and said there's this important 4th level, that of social and biological reproduction, not just production. This graph or figure might seem familiar from ecological revolutions, having the ecological core and human production, but then this ring of human reproduction before you get out to the stratosphere of consciousness. I just remember being so struck that first semester here at Berkeley, reading that book and taking this idea that our relationship with the natural world keeps getting remade and reinforced and reinvented through time. That's a constantly changing relationship. And by adding this sort of facet of change and dynamism to the original sort of set that McAvoy had, I think Merchant not only contributes sort of essential insight about women's roles in environmental transformations, among others, but also to help better articulate the process of interaction between humans and ecological systems. So I've taken that, and I then went on to take some classes up in the geography department, and now bridging both of those worlds. And I really got interested in this concept of using landscape itself as a tool. And so that's where I'm going to make this little bridge over to geography. Paul Groth, one of my, again, esteemed mentors here at Berkeley, described landscape as the interaction between people and place, arguing that what we experience as a landscape is a combination of what is physically and biologically there, and also what's in our heads, coming from Donald Meide. That sort of how we think and feel about landscape matters, and that in turn influences how we use, interpret, and change landscapes themselves. And then this idea that over time, as people live and work and interact in a landscape, the landscape itself becomes a reflection of those ideas in some subtle and sometimes hard to read ways. That, Pierce Lewis has described landscapes as our unwitting autobiographies, that we don't intend to write our stories in them yet. That's exactly what we're doing. I've always used this image behind the text, which is actually from the Carrizo Plain down south near sort of east of San Luis Obispo, an area that's been protected as a national monument for quite a long time. It hasn't been in agricultural use for decades, and yet there remains this line on the landscape that is the marker of where the landscape had been plowed. It hasn't been plowed for a very, very long time, yet the change of the structure of the soil and et cetera means that different vegetation grows above that line as below, and the mark is still there. So in this sense, looking at the landscape, you don't know that a line means agriculture was here, but if you have, it's a clue to start doing some research and looking into what is this landscape telling you. So landscape becomes a tool for understanding this relationship. I have argued, when I first started thinking about landscapes, I was often reading or thinking about natural versus cultural landscapes, and I've really come to believe that all landscapes are both, that you can't separate them out into one or the other. that downtown Manhattan has birds flying around, has trees growing, has air, has all these natural features. And the most remote and unpeopled wilderness that one can imagine still has human influence, not only from things like climate change, but also from the way that we think of it as a wilderness, and we don't allow certain activities there, and we manage the kinds of interactions you can have there. So they're all natural and cultural, and because of that constant iteration and reinvention and relationship back and forth, landscapes are also constantly dynamic. They are always dynamic, changing with both changing environmental conditions as well as changing cultural values. So I think landscape adds a really explicitly spatial element to Mergent's discussion of environmental and ecological revolutions. It really can be a powerful tool for investigating these complex interactions between communities and environments, as historic changes in landscape indicate shifting social dynamics and structures, which I think, again, is a crucial aspect of Carolyn's concept of social reproduction. So this sort of disciplinary melting pot that I've become over time. I was actually here as an undergraduate in the biology department, so I've just as many possible departments as I can get myself into. Has come together in this work that I did at Point Reyes, which was my dissertation here at Berkeley. The question really was, what happens to a working agricultural landscape when it becomes the subject of formal protection by the National Park Service? Ken Burns, in his program, has reminded us that this idea that national parks are considered national treasures, that Wallace Stegner had this idea that they're America's best idea. I think we've had a few other good ones, maybe besides that. But there's sort of this presumption that they're big capital G good. And further, please go. There we go. The founding legislation that created the Park Service in 1916 actually directs the agency to preserve parks resources for use by the public and to manage them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. This is probably fairly familiar language also to folks in the room. But I want to argue that preservation is not a neutral act, and the Park Service is not a neutral actor. That the process of protecting and managing lands exerts its own influence on the landscape in ways that we can read, and gradually changes the form and appearance of parks to reflect and reproduce the preservation agency's values as becoming reflected in the landscape. Often those changes are invisible to us as visitors. We go to Yosemite Valley and we see a version of that place, and we presume that it has always been like that because it was preserved. But for those of you who know anything about Yosemite Valley, its ecosystem has actually changed radically since it became a national park, and well, a park, at least initially in 1864. Before that, it was being burned by the Miwok Indians and had a lot of open meadows and oak woodlands. And once you stop that burning, you begin preserving it, the ecosystem changes and you get a much more thick coniferous forest moving in. But I'm not going to talk about Yosemite. I'm going to talk about Point Reyes because I have a book about that. To add to the list of book covers that we have shown today. This book, like Lynn said, was just published in 2017. Very excited to have it out almost exactly 20 years after I started it as a dissertation project. And the purpose of this book, like I said, is to try and make the effects of preservation on the land more visible through this case study of Point Reyes, which was set aside in 1962 to protect public recreation space. This is probably a familiar sign to some of you, at least, that Point Reyes is only about an hour's drive north and west of here. Convenient for graduate research. You don't need a lot of funding to go to your study site. So I mentioned it was established in 1962, mostly to protect public access to beaches as part of a big national seashore and lakeshore movement. And if you look at the website, they mostly are talking about
It was a sign.
It was a sign for both. It was protected to created to protect wilderness and natural resources as a chunk of sort of rare, undeveloped California coastline. But of course, before the park sort of showed up and before we got this national seashore, there was something there before. Of course, much further back, the Coast Miwok lived in this place. I think the latest archaeological understanding is that there were no permanent settlements on the peninsula, but there were seasonal use of people coming to and fro, which those of you who have been out there on a foggy, windy day can understand why it would only be seasonal. It's very, very cold when it's not good weather out there. But in between the Coast Miwok and the National Seashore, Point Reyes was a dairying landscape. It was, as often was the case, we had Mexican land grants. Once California became part of the Union, some white settlers who wanted to come and open some dairies challenged that. They went to court, and as often was the outcome of those kinds of cases, that land ended up in the hands of the lawyers, neither of the two parties. In this case, the lawyers had the ironic last name of Shafter. You can't make this stuff up, right? So James and Oscar Shafter and Charles Howard, who was the son-in-law of one of them, divided up the peninsula of Point Reyes into 6 sections that they each owned 2. And each of those got divided up. All the letters that you see are individual ranches, so it would be tenant run. These are lawyers, so they came up with very creative names. A ranch, B ranch, C ranch, D ranch, all the way up to the point. Solomon Pierce, a friend of theirs, on the point, so that's an Evan alphabet. Comes back down the Inverness Ridge, they run out of the alphabet, and then they have sort of more natural names down at the south end. So each of these ranches was run by a tenant family. They were all immigrant groups. There's a group from the Azores who are out by the lake house. There's a group that are Irish up near Smallest Point, and inland is mostly Italian-speaking Swiss. So you can trace the immigrant family names. Came here to work as tenants. This is sort of an unusual American dream kind of story. They end up actually owning the ranches once the heirs of the original Shafter families began selling off the pieces in the 1920s and 30s. So moving on, a lot of these ranches are still in operation. Well, some of the ranches are still in operation. And I think it's important to sort of out that this is an unusual national park. It has operating agriculture still within it, as well as extensive areas of federally designated wilderness. So the book documents sort of how our national ideas about what a park is supposed to be in quotes, have those ideas developed and changed over time, and then how those ideas exert themselves once a place becomes a park. Especially when you have a place like this one where you have a continuing working landscape. And I added a little definition of working landscape here, characterized by an intricate combination of cultivation and natural habitat, and again, shaped by the lives of people who live and work there, often over several generations, maintaining some distinct characteristics, but then also changing over time. In this case, for California, some of the families here are pretty unusual. They've been on the same ranches in the same landscape for five or six generations now, which I know back east sounds like nothing. Here it's kind of old. Because California's special. Anyway, taking Carolyn's idea of social reproduction and combining that with the spatial sense of landscape theory really allows the changes associated with preservation to come into view a bit more. So the resulting landscapes that have been produced by the Park Service represent a series of compromises between use and protection. So we go from a property map that looks like this in 1960 with 25 major ranches and then a bunch of smaller owners to a map that looks like this. These are planned recreation developments by the Park Service, some of which got implemented, some of which did not, to this, the current day map, which divides the green of the wilderness area with the sort of tan of the ranching area. No subliminal ideas about color there. And while there are still dairies and also beef ranches operating within Point Reyes, in the 55 years since the seashore was established, the number of the number of ranches has decreased. This is a map from my book showing the still operating ranches are white, but the ranches that have disappeared or gone out of business, gone out of operation, pardon me, are either shaded or darker colored in one way or another. So a lot of, now there's only 11 ranches still operating within the seashore. So we've gone from 25 to 11. I'm arguing in part due to those national ideas about what a park is supposed to be. We've also, sorry, that wasn't supposed to be there. There's also been a very wild controversy in recent years where park staff forced an 80-year oyster operation to close, despite a lot of local controversy. There were definitely, this was something that really split the West Marine community enormously. There's still people who don't speak to each other because of this controversy, arguing that the Drake's Estero, where this oyster operation existed, should be a wilderness, or should it be in sustainable agriculture? And this is a very perplexing debate where you have people who are usually on the same side, sustainable agriculture and wilderness, suddenly wanting to kill each other. So, you know, I think the making the effects of management, regardless of what direction you want the management to go, I think making the effects of management clearer, easier to see, are really important to be able to have this conversation at all. To say, you know, what is happening? How are these decisions having impacts on the landscape? And I would argue that there isn't any need to have a zero-sum game, that you can have agriculture and wilderness as a partnership, I would say, in the same place. I'm going to try and go through this very quickly because I just want to tell you a little bit about a new project that I'm starting that is not a park, which I'm very excited about, but that also, I think, reflects a lot of influence of Carolyn because I'm now diving into something of the history of science. My new research project is going to be an environmental history of the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, which is in Colorado. It is located right there. I don't have a pointer. Just on the western slope of the Continental Divide, very high. The lab itself is at about 9,500 feet, surrounded by mountains. You know, just a very, very rugged landscape. This is a photograph from 1963 taken by my mom. This is an area that, the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, or RMBL, was established on the location of an old silver mining town called Gothic, named after Gothic Mountain. It has sort of cathedral-looking spires, and so they named it Gothic. So it's on the location, this is the current day lab, or at least last summer, and this was the town back in 1881. This is a classic boom and bust town. It literally came into existence in 1879, and by 1883 it was declared dead, so it didn't last long. You can understand why, with this very, very rugged landscape, very difficult to get minerals in and out. And it's also a very personal landscape to me because this is where I grew up in the summertime. I'm the little person on this side, in the red. My parents actually, my dad's a biologist. My parents met at Rocky Mountain Lab in 1962. And Dad did research there, still does research there every single summer. And so this is a very personal place to me. We were the Gothic Kids, this little tribe of children that basically ran wild all summer long. So investigating this place is going to be really fun to try and bring together the history of science along with the personal history of this place. So I'm just starting this new work. I'm running out of time, and so I'm just going to try and wrap up here, where one of the things that's most intriguing to me about RMBL, the founder established it explicitly as a sort of with a community-based model. He wanted to encourage scientists to come to Rocky Mountain Lab to do research, but to come back, to keep returning. He said, bring your whole family, build a cabin, put down roots, come back every year. And I think that has had some effects on the science. My dad being an example. I was telling someone earlier, he missed 1964 because my sister was born, and he was 67 and 68 when he was in the Army. And otherwise, he spent part of every single summer since 1962 in this place doing scientific research. And so one of the things and he's not the only one, there's a number of these sort of perennial, almost becoming indigenous scientists that have a particular relationship with this landscape that is very different, I think, than a scientist that goes to a field station for 2 weeks, gathers some data, and leaves. So that's one of the things I really want to investigate in this new project is how is that relationship with place, how is it changing the landscape itself, but how is it also changing the science, or is it changing the science? Maybe I'm being too romantic thinking that it will. But I have the idea that there will be some unique kinds of knowledge that come out of that placeness of the work. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
We have a question for you, Mark?
Yes, I was intrigued by the refrain throughout your talk about landscape. And it's interesting to me that it began, the term itself began as a genre of painting in the 17th century. And then we have landscape gardening coming around in the 18th century, which was basically the idea to make nature imitate art. And it acquired in the 20th century a specialized meaning in ecology, basically having to do with a matter of scale. Instead of studying biotic communities that were fairly homogeneous, the landscape was a patchwork from the ecological point of view of different communities and relationships among those patches, which is actually a technical term in ecology. And so what strikes me about the term is that it has a very visual kind of emphasis, and it still, to me, seems to carry that original echo from its origins as a genre of painting. And so I think that the quotation of your definition of landscape as having a cultural, natural aridity is actually very fitting given the, so I guess I don't have a question.
Continuing our great tradition of commentary.
It all works out.
It all works out. Yeah, no, I've just been teaching a graduate reading course with some of my cultural resource management students this spring, which I was basically loosely calling landscape theory and practice. And I had them go back and read Carl Sau, back in the 1920s, writing about landscape as a way of pushing back against environmental determinism, and say, the environment doesn't cause everything, which was very popular in geography at that point. He said humans have an impact on the places that they live. And his version of landscape was very visual. It was you go out and you look at what you can see. And other folks, geographers that have come along over the years have said, well, there's also things you can't see, but that are equally important in terms of how that landscape has been shaped. So it's really trying to trace these influences through the place itself, both in the physical, what's physically there, what kinds of buildings are built, how are they structured. One of the interesting things about Rocky Mountain Lab is there's only 2 original buildings from the 1880s that remain. It's amazing that there are even 2. But when they started the lab in the 1920s, what they did was they tore down a lot of the dilapidated buildings, but used the same timbers to then build a lot of these cabins, any of which folks still live in and are incredibly small. I'm always amazed at the size of the cabin that my father and mother had my sister and I in as tiny children in one room cabin. So there's the sort of physical traces on landscape, but then there's also sort of the ideas that get influenced that influence what happens here. But I, as you may have guessed from this presentation, I'm something of an avid photographer as well. And what landscape is we all do that, right? When you hold up the phone or the camera lens or whatever device you're using, and we say, oh, I don't really want that little corner of that thing, so I'm going to edit the landscape just a little bit by making sure that telephone pole is out of the picture or something like that. And so we're changing what the landscape is through that editing process, even just taking a photo. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with the work.
Well, how does something cease to be a landscape if it ever does?
Well, that's one of the fun things with these terms, right? A landscape can be very small, it can be very large, it's just like an ecosystem. I don't think any place on Earth isn't a landscape, but it's more, it's not saying something is a landscape or isn't, it's more how can I use landscape as a tool to understand these interactions, to see change over time, physically as well as seeing it in the documents, and seeing how those two go back and forth, and then reminding folks that when you go out to go to Pointers or you go to Yosemite, that the landscape that you see, the kind of ecological systems, the kind of buildings, represent choices that people have made in many cases, or non-choices that people have made, as people have been pushed out, and different kinds of practices have come together. So trying to see history in a very spatial sense.
Seascapes doesn't work that way.
I'm also a recreational sailor, so you're starting a very difficult topic. If you include all the shipwrecks down the bottom, so you bet. Seascapes too.
We have time for one more question before the break, depending on whether. I work in the Pacific with Marshall Islanders and other Pacific Islanders. And one of the problems with the term landscape, very much apropos to this last comment, is the terrestrial bias that Euro-Americans have in seeing the world, this water world, as a place of land and landscape and its relationship to property and rights and all of that. And you talk to folks there, they say we are ocean people, we're not. So if you're going to destroy by nuclear weapons all of our area, that we only get compensation for the 7 acres that you define as our area,
Right.
That kind of thing. It has huge ramifications for the language.
There's actually, I have 3 students now that I count them up over the last couple of years from our, I'm involved with a master's level cultural resources management program at Sonoma State. And we have increasing numbers of students interested in maritime cultural landscapes, which get exactly at that, saying you can't use the water-land boundary as a boundary, because so much of this, they're looking at 3 of them looked at doggle ports up and down the coast, which are ports small enough that a dog can't turn around in them. That's why they were called that. Very sort of utilitarian little find a port where you can, for mostly for the timber industry up and down California coast, but also for ranching, trying to get products off the land and onto ships to take to San Francisco before there was good land transportation. And absolutely that boundary between the land and the sea and the shipwrecks under the water and the iron bolts on the shore that are connecting them are all part of a single cultural landscape.
Thank you so much, Laura. We're going to have to stop here.